The train noise was a steady, rhythmic thing. Wheels on rails, the faint whistle of wind against the windows, the distant rattle of someone's cauldron poorly secured in a trunk overhead. And Harry had been ignoring all of it for the better part of 40 minutes. He had been looking at the photographs instead. There were 4 of them, slipped from the front pages of the album Hagrid had put together over the summer. Photographs gathered from people who'd known them, he'd said, in a voice that kept almost cracking, and pressed into Harry's hands in August, along with an expression that was caught somewhere between pride and grief. The album itself was in his trunk, up in the luggage rack, too large and too careful a thing to spread open on a train seat. But these 4 Harry had tucked into his jacket pocket before leaving that morning. He had them out now, spread across his knees like a hand of cards he didn't know how to play. In the first, a woman with dark red hair was laughing at something out of frame. Her head was thrown back. The laughter was the kind that didn't care who was watching. In the second, the same woman stood in a garden with a man who had Harry's exact hair and the same round glasses Harry wore, and they were holding hands in the easy, absent way of people who have forgotten it's a thing they're doing. Harry turned the photographs over. His mother had written on the back of each one, in small, looping cursive, dates, occasions, a name or 2. Her handwriting slanted cheerfully to the right, and the letter G did something particular, a long, hooked descender that curled back under itself, a shepherd's crook, and Harry had spent a significant portion of the last 30 days learning that shape. He could have drawn it from memory. He was fairly sure he had, in the margins of several things he wasn't supposed to be drawing in the margins of. He turned the photographs back over and looked at her face. He didn't know what he was looking for. That was the specific quality of it. Not grief, exactly, because grief required something to have been present before its absence could register, and Harry had never had her present. It was more like the ache of a word that was always on the tip of his tongue and never quite arrived. He looked at the way she threw her head back when she laughed, the line of her jaw, the shape of her hands. He looked, and the train moved north, and he did not find what he was looking for, because what he was looking for did not exist. The compartment door slid open. He looked up. A girl stepped in, his age maybe, with dark hair and the kind of deliberate stillness that made you aware of it. She wasn't wearing robes yet. None of them were. The school robes were somewhere in their trunks. She looked at Harry with pale grey eyes, registered whatever was in his expression without visible reaction, and sat down across from him without asking. Harry almost said something. He wasn't sure what. She set a sealed envelope on the seat beside her. She adjusted it by a small degree, aligning it parallel to the edge of the seat, and then she pushed it across the gap between them with one deliberate finger, and sat back. Harry looked at it. His full name was on the front in formal script, the name nobody used, the whole 3-part thing, and beneath that, a line of text he had to squint at, which referenced something called a Potter green grass arrangement, and a date that, when he worked it out, appeared to be from the year he turned 1. He picked it up. He opened it. The parchment inside was heavy, the stiff archival sort, and it was dense with formal language he had no framework for. Party of the first part, party of the second part, terms of consideration. But his eyes moved through it quickly, the way they always did with things he didn't understand, looking for something solid to anchor on. They found his name, then the name across from his. Then, in a section near the bottom that used the word betrothal in a context he couldn't entirely follow, 2 signatures, James Fleamont Potter, and below that, in a different hand, Lily J. Potter. His hands stopped. He'd been reading quickly, scanning ahead for the part where it resolved into sense, and his eyes were already past the signatures when his brain caught up. He went back. The second signature was looping, cheerful, slanted to the right. The J, her middle initial, had a descender that curled back under itself, a long hooked thing, a shepherd's crook. He knew that G. It wasn't a thought, exactly. It was more like the thing that happens when you touch something hot before your hand has finished deciding to pull away, the body knowing before the mind does. Harry sat very still. The train moved. The hills outside the window were the green of early September, luminously green, the way things are when summer has just begun to consider leaving, and none of it seemed to be quite real. The photographs were still on his knee on one side, and the contract was in his hands on the other, and his mother's signature was on the inside of the fold, and she had written it before he could speak. The compartment door banged open. Ron Weasley came through it, carrying his owl cage in one hand and a crumpled paper bag in the other, and was already talking. "Couldn't find the food trolley yet. She said she'd come back around, so I've got Mum's sandwiches. There are still 2 left if—" He stopped. He looked at the girl. He looked at Harry. He looked at the parchment in Harry's hands. His mouth stayed slightly open. "Sit down," Harry said. Ron sat down. He placed the owl cage with great care and settled his hands on his knees and looked as though he had several pressing things to say and was heroically refraining from saying any of them. The girl glanced at Ron, appeared to conclude he didn't require a response, and looked back at Harry. "This document," she said, picking up in the same even tone as before, as if Ron's arrival had been a brief pause rather than an entrance, "was signed by your parents before your 2nd birthday. My family has held it for the past 10 years. Now that you've received your Hogwarts letter, the terms of the arrangement require that we present it to you formally." A beat. "I've presented it." Ron opened his mouth. "A betrothal contract," she said. "My name is Daphne Greengrass." Ron closed his mouth. Harry said, "Why are you the one presenting it? Wouldn't this normally be a solicitor or someone official?" "Yes," she said. She reached for her bag. "I wanted to see your face when you read it," she said. There was nothing readable in her voice. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, not apology. Just the sentence, offered plainly, as though it were the most logical answer. "You have 90 days to decide what to do with it. If you want to void the contract, both of us have to sign a renunciation. If you want to consider it, you do nothing. After 90 days, the window closes." "Closes meaning what?" Harry said. "Meaning it remains in effect until we're 17. She stood, her bag at her shoulder. "You have time." She left. The door slid shut behind her with a quiet, final click. Ron turned to look at Harry. His expression contained a great deal of feeling and no idea at all what to do with it. Harry looked down at the document. At some point, he had folded it along its crease, some reflex closing it, before he'd made the decision to close it. He thought about the signature inside. His mother had stood somewhere in 1981 with a quill in her hand and signed her name to this arrangement. She had done it for reasons he didn't know, with a family whose name he'd never heard. And then she had died, and the document had sat in a Greengrass family home for 10 years, while Harry grew up in the Dursleys' spare room, being told nothing. And today, a girl his age had boarded a train and pushed it across a seat at him without preamble, because she wanted to see his face. "That was a Greengrass," Ron said. "I know," Harry said. He tucked the contract into his inside jacket pocket. He could feel its weight against his chest when he sat back. Stiff parchment, old ink, the particular heaviness of something that had been waiting a long time. The train moved north. The late summer hills went gold at their edges in the afternoon light. shadows spreading slow and long across the valleys below. And Harry watched them and said nothing. And after a while, Ron offered him one of the remaining sandwiches without comment. And Harry took it without comment. And they sat like that. 2 11-year-olds in a compartment, going quiet in the way that compartments do when the right words haven't appeared yet, while somewhere against Harry's ribs, his mother's handwriting kept its patient 30-year vigil. Outside, England went scrolling past in long afternoon light, indifferent and beautiful, the shadows in the valleys going blue as the sun descended. Harry pressed his palm flat against the outside of his jacket pocket and left it there. The boats came out of the dark in a long, slow line, small lanterns at each prow throwing yellow light across the water, and Harry could see the castle now, properly, completely, in a way that hadn't been possible from the station or the carriages, rising from the cliff-top across the lake with every window lit against the October sky. The towers went up into the dark, and the lake was perfectly still beneath them, and Harry sat with Ron and 2 other first-years he hadn't spoken to yet, and the contract pressed against his ribs inside his jacket, and tried to be present. Ron had stopped glancing at him somewhere around the midpoint of the crossing. He had settled into a watchful quiet instead, arms folded against the cold, eyes on the castle. Harry was grateful for this in a way he didn't know how to name. The boats scraped against the stone bank. A large voice directed them out and upward. Harry stepped onto the bank and felt the particular damp cold of a Scottish loch at night, and the castle above them went on being enormous, and he followed the crowd up through a low archway and into the entrance hall and thought, "This is where I live now." The thought didn't land. Professor McGonagall was waiting in a small side chamber, and she occupied it completely, the way certain very precise people manage to fill spaces larger than themselves. Square spectacles, a severe bun, black robes, the distinct impression that she had been standing in exactly that posture since considerably before any of them were born. She told them what was going to happen, the sorting, the houses, the expectation that their behavior would reflect well on the school. Harry listened to approximately half of it. He was looking for Daphne Greengrass. She wasn't difficult to find. She stood slightly apart from the first-years who were already sorting themselves by social gravity. The pale, sharp-faced boy Harry had met briefly on the platform, fair-haired and assured, and the girl beside him with watchful, narrow eyes, and a taller boy who hadn't said a word to anyone and appeared profoundly uninterested in rectifying this. Daphne stood a foot away from all of them, hands clasped, listening to McGonagall with complete attention. Her posture was the same as it had been in the compartment. She seemed to be the same person in every room she entered, which Harry found obscurely unsettling. She didn't look at him. He looked at the floor. Then McGonagall opened the door to the great hall, and the thinking stopped. It was the ceiling that did it. It was the night sky, the actual October night sky, somehow in the ceiling, stars and all. A depth of dark overhead with 1,000 floating candles suspended between it and the 4 long tables below, and every face in the hall was turned toward them, hundreds of students already seated, and the combined effect was of walking into something much larger than a room. Harry walked in with the others and kept his eyes on the ceiling for a moment longer than was probably polite. An old battered hat sat on a stool at the front of the hall. The rip near its brim opened, and it began to sing. Harry barely heard the words. He was looking at the Slytherin table, trying to identify it by the colour of the scarves. The sorting began. Students were called in alphabetical order, and Harry watched each one walk to the stool and return to the tables, changed in some fundamental administrative sense, assigned, categorized, placed. The hall had a steady rhythm to it: name, walk, hat, pause, declaration, applause. Draco Malfoy's name was called. He sat on the stool with the assurance of someone who already knew the answer. And the hat was barely on his head, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, before it called Slytherin. The Slytherin table applauded in a contained and deliberate way. Draco Malfoy walked to it and sat, and then he turned, almost immediately, to look at the remaining first years. Harry felt the gaze move across him and continue. Daphne Greengrass. The hat settled on her head and was off again in what seemed like less than a breath. Slytherin. Immediate. No deliberation. She stood, walked to the Slytherin table, and sat with the same calm composure she had brought to the train compartment, as though she had simply continued being herself from one room to the next. Harry Potter. The whispering was immediate. He'd expected it, and it still felt strange. And then he was sitting on the stool with the hat over his eyes, and the hall had disappeared into darkness, and a dry, amused voice spoke directly into the inside of his head. "Interesting," said the voice. "Plenty of courage, yes. A reasonable mind. Not a bad will to prove yourself either. Considerable, actually. And I see a talent for survival that Salazar Slytherin himself would have recognized. You could do very well in Slytherin." "Not Slytherin," Harry thought. There was a pause. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Very well," the hat said, sounding not entirely convinced. "Better be. Gryffindor." The red and gold table came apart in noise. Harry walked toward it with a sensation that was mostly relief and only partly understood, sat down, and found himself beside a round-faced boy called Neville Longbottom, who was still recovering from his own hat experience, and who said he'd been afraid it would take all night, and Harry said him too, which wasn't true, but felt like the right thing to say. Draco Malfoy, across the hall, was not looking at Daphne Greengrass. He was being very deliberate about not looking at her, the specific way that requires more effort than looking would. Harry noticed it from across the hall, in the way you notice something that isn't meant to be seen. The jaw fractionally set, a glance permitted, and then retracted too quickly. The posture adjusted toward a careful, performed neutrality. Whatever had happened on the train, and something had, from Malfoy's side of it, as much as anyone else's, he had not decided yet what to do about it. He was filing it away. Harry noted this. He didn't know yet what it meant. Dumbledore rose to speak, and the hall went quiet without anyone asking it to, the way large spaces quiet themselves when something happens at their center. He was very old and very tall, with a silver beard that reached the table, and half-moon spectacles pushed down a crooked nose, and he spoke without any particular effort about the term and the school, and things Harry didn't retain. And then the food appeared. Simply appeared. Empty plates, and then not empty, and the feast began. Snape was at the staff table. He had found Harry once during the sorting, and moved on, and found him again during Dumbledore's remarks, and moved on, and found him now, in the way of someone running a check at regular intervals. There was a measuring quality to it. Harry looked at his plate. The food was excellent, and he didn't really notice. He looked across the hall. Daphne Greengrass was eating with the same composed, unhurried attention she brought to everything, her eyes on her meal. She had not, as far as Harry could see, looked across the hall at any point during the feast. The Slytherin table was a long way away in the warm candlelight, and Draco Malfoy was 3 places from her, and the hall was enormous and full of noise and warmth and the smell of roast chicken, and somewhere above it all the enchanted sky went on being the sky. The distance between the Gryffindor table and the Slytherin table was not a matter of feet. It was structural. The hall was built to hold that distance. 4 tables, 4 houses, a gap of polished stone floor between each one that was not a neutral space, but a boundary, something older than anyone in this room. Harry was sitting on one side of it, and she was sitting on the other, and the contract in his pocket ran between them like a wire, and nobody in this entire loud, warm, crowded room knew about it except the two of them. He told Neville that yes, he thought the ceiling was probably the best thing about the place. Neville agreed that it was. The walk back to Gryffindor Tower went up several staircases, two of which moved while they were on them, with a grinding, unhurried certainty, and Harry followed the group in the dark behind a red-haired prefect who seemed to know the route by heart. The moving staircases swung and locked, and they stepped across the gaps, and the portraits watched them go, and Harry kept his hands in his pockets. Ron caught up with him on the second landing and matched his pace. He waited until they'd made the top of a particular staircase before he said anything. "So what are you going to do?" Ron said. "About the contract." "I don't know yet," Harry said. The staircase swung. They stepped across the gap with the group. "She's a Slytherin," Ron said. "I noticed," Harry said. Ron accepted this. They climbed the rest of the way in silence, following the prefect through a portrait hole and into warmth and firelight, and Harry sat down in an armchair and didn't take the contract out of his pocket and tried not to think about it, which was not the same thing. Hogwarts settled into itself, or rather, they settled into Hogwarts, which was not quite the same thing. The castle had clearly been managing without them for some time, and would continue to do so, and it proceeded with the quiet indifference of something very old and very certain of its own dimensions. Harry learned his timetable. He found the library on the 3rd day by accident, and the owlery on the 5th by necessity. He learned which staircases moved, and at what hour, and that the Transfiguration classroom was the coldest room he'd been in since the Dursleys' spare room, which hadn't been much warmer than the exterior. The contract moved to the left pocket of his school robes on the first morning, when the jacket went into the trunk. It stayed there. He showed it to Ron properly on the 4th night, dormitory, after lights out. The other 3 boys were asleep. Neville had been asleep since 9:30, and the other 2 had argued themselves unconscious sometime after 10. Harry pulled the curtains of his 4-poster, and Ron pulled the curtains of his, and Harry passed the contract across the gap between the beds in the thin light of a Lumos charm. Ron read it. He read it slowly and with care. He got to the bottom. He sat for a moment with the contract on his knee. "The Greengrasses," he said. "They're sacred 28. I don't know what that is. Old pure blood families. There are 28 of them. The ones that stayed. I mean, the ones that have always been." Ron stopped. "My mum talks about it. It's a thing." He looked up. "Harry, your mum was Muggle-born." "I know. She was Muggle-born, and she signed this with a sacred 28 family." Ron looked at the parchment again, as though it might have clarified. I don't know what that would even—" He shook his head. "My mum is going to have a lot of thoughts about this. I'm warning you now." "Your mum doesn't know yet?" "She will," Ron said flatly. He handed the contract back. "She always finds out." They came downstairs the next evening still at it, not with any heat, more like 2 people who kept being pulled back to a question neither of them could solve. And Hermione looked up from her place near the fire. She had a textbook open, a quill behind her ear, and the expression of someone who had been tracking something in their peripheral vision for several days. "Is this about whatever was in that envelope?" she said. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked at Harry. "You weren't subtle," Hermione said. "On the train. Show me." Harry handed her the contract. She read it the way she read everything, with the precise, cataloguing attention of someone building a mental index in real time, eyes moving line by line, one hand smoothing the parchment flat against her knee. Her bushy brown hair fell forward. She pushed it back. When she finished, she looked up with an expression that was difficult to name. "I need to go to the library," she said. "It's 8:30, Ron said. "I know what time it is." She handed the contract back to Harry and stood. "I'll be in the library." She was. The first potions lesson came on Friday. The classroom was in the dungeons, which meant cold stone walls and the sharp, mineral smell of things that required careful handling, and 40 minutes in which Harry, who had done what he privately considered a reasonable amount of reading, began to revise that assessment. Professor Snape entered without preamble. He was tall, with greasy black hair falling to his shoulders, and a sallow face with a hooked nose, and the particular quality of stillness of someone who finds everything around him slightly beneath the threshold of urgency. He wore black robes and moved between the work tables, and he spoke in a low voice that carried to every corner of the room, and this was intentional. "You are here," Snape said, "to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making. That is, if any of you have the capacity for subtlety." His eyes moved across the rows with the unhurried pace of someone taking inventory. They reached Harry and stopped. "Potter, a bezoar. What is it, and what is it used for?" Harry had read about bezoars. He was fairly certain they were. "A stone," he said, "from an animal. It's used as some kind of something curative, presumably." Snape's voice did not change. "Since we are apparently proceeding at the level of informed guessing. A bezoar is a stone found in the stomach of a goat. It serves as an antidote to most common poisons. One might consider knowing this before attending a class in which poisons are routinely present." A pause. "Monkshood, Potter. Its relation to wolfsbane." "They're the same plant," Harry said. He was certain of this one. "They are," Snape said, with no warmth at all in the agreement. "None." "Also called aconite. It is, however, reassuring to know that equivalent naming conventions present no difficulty, even where the actual properties of the plant in question remain a mystery. Open your books." Harry opened his book. He stared at the first page and felt the blood in his face and didn't look up. Daphne Greengrass was 2 rows ahead of him, to the left. She was writing in careful, even lines on a sheet of parchment. She had not looked at him during either of Snape's questions. Not with gratification. Not with sympathy. She had the composed attention of someone who was there to take notes, and who was doing that, and nothing else. He watched her for a moment from the corner of his eye, and then looked back at his book, and it didn't tell him anything either. The corridor outside the classroom was cold stone and dungeon air, and Harry was walking out with his bag when she fell into step beside him from somewhere to his left without apparent transition. She spoke without slowing or looking at him. "The contract requires formal acknowledgement within 90 days of delivery. That is November 29th. A half beat. If you intend to void it, you must sign a renunciation. Both of us must. If you intend to consider it, you do nothing." She turned at the junction ahead and walked in the other direction. He heard her footsteps for a moment, and then he didn't. Harry stood in the corridor with his bag and his books, and nothing in particular to do with his hands. He found a windowsill in the entrance hall and sat on it with his bag across his knees. Students moved across the hall below in the between-class current. He watched them and thought about what she had said. Both parties must sign. Not, he could sign a renunciation and send it to her. Both of them, which meant going to Daphne Greengrass and asking her to agree to something, asking her for something. and that changed the shape of it in a way he hadn't considered. He had been thinking, in a vague and unexamined way, that the contract was a thing he could simply refuse, that his refusal would be the end of it. It wasn't. It was a mutual instrument. He couldn't dissolve it unilaterally any more than she could. And then there was the other thing, which he hadn't said aloud to Ron and didn't intend to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The contract was parchment his mother's hands had touched. She had taken up a quill and pressed it to this specific page, and the marks her hand made were still there, because nothing had happened to remove them, and it was the only thing like that he currently possessed. The photograph album had photographs of her. This had what she wrote. Voiding it meant losing that, which was probably a terrible reason to hold a betrothal contract. It was, nonetheless, a reason. Hermione came back from the library that evening with 2 sheets of parchment covered in her smallest handwriting, and sat down between them by the fire, with the purposeful air of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for and wanted it acknowledged. Betrothal contracts in wizarding family law, she said, are not legally binding in the sense of compelling anything. I checked 3 separate sources. What they create is an obligation of consideration. Both parties are formally required to engage with the arrangement for a specified period. After that period, or at magical majority, the obligation expires naturally. She looked at Harry. You are not being compelled to marry anyone. You are being required to think about it. For the next 6 years, Ron said. Until you're 17. Yes. Hermione folded the top sheet with the neat, finished precision of someone closing a case. However, it can be dissolved before then, by mutual agreement. Both signatures. She looked at Harry. Which means, I'd have to ask her, Harry said. Yes, Hermione said. She picked up the second sheet. I thought you should know that before you decided anything. She settled back in her chair and began to read. Harry looked at the fire for a while. Then he put his hand in his left pocket and did not take anything out of it. The common room was quiet at this hour. Most of the first years had gone to bed, and the older students who remained kept to themselves with the particular self-containment of Slytherins who understood that the value of a room was not diminished by silence. The fire burned green in the grate, always green here, some quality of the dungeon stone or the water above, and the black lake pressed against the low windows with the impenetrable dark of water that had no visible floor. Daphne sat at the small writing table near the far wall and composed. Dear Mother and Father, I am writing to confirm that I have completed the family obligation regarding the Potter arrangement. I am settled at Hogwarts. The sorting was without incident, and I am in the expected house. She paused, read it back, continued. I delivered the contract on the 1st of September on the Hogwarts Express from London. Potter received it personally. He read it in full. He has not, as of this writing, exercised the renunciation option. I have informed him of the mechanism and of the deadline. November 29th. She laid the quill down for a moment. His reaction was as anticipated. What she did not write, she had gone herself. She was 11. She was not required to be the one who walked into a compartment on the Hogwarts Express and pushed a sealed envelope across a train seat at a boy she had never met. The formal protocol allowed for a family solicitor. Her parents had assumed a family solicitor would handle it. She had told them, the morning before she boarded, that she preferred to do it correctly. Her mother had not objected. She had wanted to see his face. She had known who Harry Potter was, of course. Everyone knew. The boy whose scar had ended a war, whose name meant different things to different people depending on what they had lost. She had grown up with his name, the way you grow up with weather, always present, not quite confronted. What she had not done was think about his face. She had expected the famous boy, the self-consciousness of someone who has been looked at all his life and hasn't decided what to do with it. She had practiced the delivery. She had rehearsed her own expression. She had not been prepared for his hands to stop. He had been reading, quickly, the way someone reads who is looking for the part that makes sense of the rest. And he had found the signatures, and his hands had simply stopped moving. Not for an audience, not dramatically, just the body's honest response to something landing in it before the mind has had time to prepare. She had sat across from him in a train compartment and watched this happen, and she had not known what to do with the fact that it made her feel something she had no category for. She was not going to write that to her parents. She picked up the quill. I will write again at half-term with a further update. I trust everything at home is well. Yours faithfully, Daphne Blaise Zabini crossed the common room at 10:30, moving with the economy of someone who considers crossing a room a moderate imposition, and settled himself into the armchair nearest the fire. He glanced at her parchment. "Writing to your family about the Potter business?" he said. "Writing to my family," Daphne said. Blaise accepted the distinction without comment. He looked at the fire with the composed boredom of someone who found everything faintly beneath comment and wanted you to know it. "The whole arrangement is rather astonishing," he said. "A Greengrass. With that situation." A pause. "I suppose the contract was signed before anyone could have anticipated how things would turn out." "Many arrangements were made before things turned out as they did," Daphne said. "He turned down Slytherin," Blaise said. "I've heard it from 2 separate people now. The Hat considered it for some length of time." "He said not Slytherin." The way he said it implied that this was the relevant data point, and that he had drawn conclusions from it, and that his conclusions were not flattering to Harry Potter. "I find that informative." "Moderately," Daphne agreed. Blaise opened his book. The conversation was, by mutual unspoken agreement, over. Pansy Parkinson raised the matter the following morning at breakfast, with the particular urgency of someone who had been waiting since she woke up to say a thing, and had finally arrived at the appropriate moment. She settled next to Daphne and said, without preamble, "I heard from one of the 3rd years that your contract is with a Muggle-born's son." "My contract is with Harry Potter," Daphne said. "His mother was a Muggle-born." Pansy said this in the tone of someone presenting evidence that ought to be self-explaining. "A mudblood. And his father. The Potters aren't Sacred 28. They're an old family, but they're not—" "I know the Potters' lineage," Daphne said. The expression on Pansy's face moved through several stages that were not difficult to read. She did not say any of the things she was visibly thinking, because she was 11 and had enough awareness of how the hierarchy worked to know that Daphne outranked her by 2 measurable lines of pure blood genealogy, and there was no version of those things that ended well for Pansy. What Pansy said was, "Well, I'm sure you know what you're doing." "Yes," said Daphne. The disapproval remained, ambient and clearly legible to anyone paying attention, for the rest of the meal. He found her alone by the fire that evening. She had expected it. He had been performing a careful not looking at her since the sorting, and that kind of deliberate not looking was never incidental. He sat down in the armchair across from her, with the ease of someone who considers all furniture to be essentially his by permanent right. He began without preamble. "What does the contract actually say?" "The terms." "What any standard betrothal arrangement says," Daphne said. "Terms of consideration, the parties named, the expiry conditions, and the renunciation mechanism." "When was it signed?" Before my first birthday. The date is in the family archive if you want to verify it. He looked at her with the particular patience of someone waiting to see if she will give him something useful by accident. She returned the look with the specific quality of attention she had been practicing since she was old enough to understand what it meant to give nothing away in a room. "Did your family know Lily Potter?" he said. The question was more specific than the others. She noted that. "My family was approached by her," Daphne said. "She came to them. The proposal was hers." She did not say what she knew of the reasoning. Her parents had given her the outline, not the details. And even if she had known the details, she would not have offered them to Draco Malfoy by a fire on a Wednesday evening. "And what does your family intend?" he said, "now that it's been put into play?" She let the beat develop before she answered. It was, she had found, never a mistake to let a beat develop. "What every family intends," she said, "to behave appropriately." He held her gaze. She could see him looking for the edge of it, the place where what she had said ended, and what she actually thought began. He was good at this for 11. He would be considerably better later, she suspected, though better in the service of what was still an open question. He did not find it. "Of course," he said. He stood and adjusted the front of his robes with the neat particularity of someone who always closes a scene on his own terms. "That's all any of us can do, I suppose." He left. Daphne looked at the fire and did not watch him go. She knew what he would do next. Not tonight, and not this week. He would sit with it through the term. He would write to his father at Christmas, and Lucius Malfoy would form a view about the Potter Greengrass situation, and that view would return to Hogwarts with Draco in January in some form. She did not know yet what form. She would find out. She had given him nothing he could use. The fact that he had come to ask was, itself, information. The others had gone up by the time she moved to the window. The Slytherin common room's windows were narrow and set low in the dungeon stone, and the Black Lake at this hour was simply dark. No light reaching from above, no surface to distinguish, only the press of water against old glass, and now and then the passage of something large enough to displace the dark without becoming visible. Daphne stood with her hands at her sides and looked at it. She was not distressed. She was not frightened or resigned or resentful. She was keeping her own counsel as she had kept it her whole life. She was counting days. From the 1st of September. 90 total. 63 remaining as of tonight. She stood at the window a while longer. Then she went to bed. 3 weeks into term, Hermione spread 4 sheets of close-covered parchment across the common room table and put her hands flat on them and looked at Harry. "All right," she said. "I've finished." Ron leaned in from the other side. Harry put down his charms essay. The summary, as Hermione delivered it, was this: "Wizarding betrothal contracts, when signed by both parties with valid legal witnesses, constituted genuine binding instruments under wizarding family law. Binding in the sense of creating enforceable obligations, not marriage, not coercion, but obligations. Specifically, an obligation of formal consideration. Both parties were required to engage with the arrangement for the duration of the specified window, after which the contract expired at wizarding majority, age 17, unless both parties had already exercised the mutual renunciation clause. So I can't just refuse it," Harry said. "Not unilaterally, no. You'd need Daphne's signature on a renunciation as well." "Right, I knew that part." "The part you may not have considered," Hermione said, in the careful tone of someone who has considered all the parts, "is that the contract also creates obligations for her. She can't void it alone, either." So the 90-day window is actually a period during which both of you have to decide whether to co-sign a renunciation, which requires agreement, or do nothing and let it run until you're 17. Harry sat with this for a moment. So neither of us can just make it go away, he said. No, Hermione said. Both of you have to want it gone. She stacked the parchment sheets neatly. Ron watched Harry with the expression he had been wearing for the better part of 3 weeks. The expression of someone who has opinions he is heroically refraining from offering. You should talk to a teacher, Hermione said. McGonagall or... McGonagall, Harry said. He waited after Transfiguration the following Tuesday. The other students filed out. The room was shared with Slytherin, which meant that among the departing he noted in passing the particular quality of Daphne Greengrass's not looking at him as she left. And Harry stayed at his desk until the room was empty. Professor McGonagall was already at her desk when he approached, with a stack of essays she was marking with the systematic precision of someone who has been marking essays for decades and has made a private peace with the endeavor. She looked up. Potter. Professor McGonagall. He put the contract on her desk. I wonder if you could. I wanted to ask someone about this. Hermione Granger says it's legally real, but I wanted to ask you. She looked at the parchment without touching it for a moment. Then she picked it up. She read it the way certain very precise people read documents. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the deliberate economy of someone covering every line and committing what they find. Her expression didn't change. It didn't change in the specific way of someone making an effort, which was different from the way of someone who has nothing to control. She turned the parchment over and looked at the signatures, and was still. How long have you had this? She said. Since the 1st of September. The train. She looked at him then, over the top of the parchment. Her square spectacles caught the afternoon light. The Greengrass girl gave it to you. Yes. I see. She set the parchment on the desk, carefully, aligned with the edge. She looked at it for one more moment. This is a matter for the headmaster. She did not say she was surprised. She did not say she had never seen it, or that it was unexpected, or that she couldn't imagine why Lily Potter would have done such a thing. She said, "This is a matter for the headmaster." And then she picked up her quill, and that was the end of it. Harry picked up the contract and walked to the door. He turned back. "Professor, did you know about this?" McGonagall looked at him over her spectacles for a moment that was slightly longer than a pause and slightly shorter than an answer. Then she said, "The headmaster will see you." She returned to her essays. Harry went out into the corridor and stood there for a moment with the contract in his hand. She had been careful with it. Not the way you were careful with something unfamiliar, with the wariness of a person who didn't know what it was. She had been careful with it, the way you were careful with something you recognized, the way you picked up a thing you knew had weight. He filed this. The stone gargoyle outside the headmaster's office moved aside when Harry gave it the password McGonagall had written on a slip of parchment, and the moving staircase spiraled him upward in the particular grinding silence of enchanted stone, and then he was outside the door. Inside, the desk, and behind it, Dumbledore. The room was full of the small mechanical sounds of silver instruments Harry couldn't name, delicate things on spindly tables that emitted occasional puffs of smoke or rotated slowly on their own axes, for reasons that were presumably important. The walls held paintings, mostly sleeping figures in heavy frames, a few of whom had cracked open an eye and were watching Harry with the attentive discretion of people who know their role in a scene. On a perch beside the window, a phoenix, brilliantly scarlet, close to a burning by the look of it, surveyed the room with the self-possession of something that had done this many times. Dumbledore gestured at the chair across from him. Harry sat. "I imagine Professor McGonagall told you something about why you're here," Dumbledore said. His voice was the same as Harry had heard it at the sorting and the feast, unhurried, warm, with the particular quality of a person who has practiced absolute patience and no longer has to think about it. "She said it was a matter for you," Harry said. He looked at Harry over his half-moon spectacles with the blue eyes that seemed to be looking at something slightly further away than the thing in front of them. "May I see it?" Harry put the contract on the desk. Dumbledore read it. His expression gave nothing away. He turned the page, found the signatures, and looked at them for a moment with an attention that was somehow different from his attention to everything else. More precise, or perhaps just more private. He did not say anything. He read it twice, Harry thought, or perhaps 3 times. Then he put it down. "Your mother," he said, "was not an impulsive woman." Harry waited. "Whatever she signed for a reason." He looked at Harry. She was careful. She thought things through. Whatever the reason for this arrangement, it was not carelessness. "Did you know about this?" Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. Not past him. Directly at him this time. "I knew your mother well, Harry," he said. "She was one of the finest witches I have ever had the honor of watching grow up." It was not a yes. It was not a no. Harry recognized this was not an accident. "Did you know?" he said again. The second time came out more level than he intended, which perhaps said something about the last 3 weeks. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Your mother," he said, "was not an impulsive woman." The same sentence, offered again, as though for the first time. Harry looked at the desk between them. Dumbledore could void the contract. He knew that, from Hermione's research, the headmaster held a legal guardianship for all students in matters pertaining to their Hogwarts life, a kind of in loco parentis that extended to exactly the kind of legal arrangements that followed students through the school gates. If he wanted to, he could sign a guardian's renunciation and have done with it. He picked up the contract and held it across the desk to Harry. "You have time to understand it," he said. "Take the time." He looked, for just a moment, like a person about to add something. The look passed. He did not add it. Harry took the contract. The moving staircase deposited him back outside the stone gargoyle, and the gargoyle sealed itself, and the corridor was the corridor, the same stone floors and the same torch brackets, and the distant sound of students somewhere above him, going about the business of having an ordinary afternoon. He had the contract. He had 2 adults who clearly knew things he didn't know, and had decided, separately, to leave him with the not knowing. He had 60 days left, and he had no idea why his mother had walked into this arrangement deliberately, chosen a family, gone to them, proposed it, and signed her name before he was old enough to ask her why. He was 11 years old. The question had been answered before he was old enough to form it. He stood in the corridor for a while. A ghost drifted through the wall beside him and out the other side without acknowledging him, which seemed appropriate. Then he put the contract in his left pocket, where it lived, and went to find Ron and Hermione. He woke knowing what day it was. He had always known, though he hadn't always known what it meant. October 31st had existed in his life as a particular kind of day for as long as he could remember. His parents died in a car crash, they said. Halloween night, 1981. He had been told this without kindness and without detail, and for 10 years it had been all he had. Now he knew. Now he was 11 years old, and he knew that no car crash had killed them, and that this was the day, the 10-year anniversary of it, the exact night. And he lay in his dormitory bed and looked at the ceiling and did not know what to do with any of this. He went to breakfast. He ate something. He could not have said what. Classes happened. In Charms, Ron made a remark about Hermione under his breath, something careless, the kind of thing that sounds like nothing until you see the face it lands on. And Harry saw Hermione's expression tighten and then go very still, and then she left for the bathroom at the first opportunity and did not come back to class. In the afternoon he went to the library. He sat at a table in the back, in the quieter section where the books on wizarding legal precedents lived in tall, dark shelves, and he took the contract out of his robes. He read it properly, every word, in order, the party of the first part and the party of the second part, and the terms of consideration, and the 90-day window, and the expiry clause. And the signatures. He had held this parchment for almost 2 months and read the signatures many times, but today they did something to the center of his chest he had mostly managed to avoid feeling in daylight. She had written this in 1981, before that October, and the looping, rightward slanting hand was the same one he knew from the backs of photographs. And she had made this arrangement for reasons she had not left an explanation for, with a family he had only met at 11 in the form of a dark-haired girl on a train. He sat with that for a long time. He did not notice Daphne Greengrass comes in. She had seen him before he saw her, and she stood for a moment in the aisle between shelves, quite still, with the manner of someone deciding whether to proceed. The contract was on the table in front of him. She sat at the far end of the same table, set down her bag, opened a book, and did not ask him anything. He became aware of her presence, gradually, the way you become aware of light changing in a room. And he looked up, and she was reading. He looked back at the contract. They sat like that for a long time. The library was quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, the feast preparations continued. Here, nothing but old books and the two of them not speaking. Harry looked up. "Did your family know her?" he said. "Actually know her?" Daphne looked up from her book. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression he had spent 2 months learning to read, and still could not. "I was 1 year old when the contract was signed," she said. "I don't remember any of it." "I know." He meant, "I know you don't remember." He meant, "That's not what I asked." Something in his face must have communicated the distinction, because she closed the book. "My parents told me," she said. "Lily Potter came to our house in 1981. She paused. "Not a solicitor, not a representative. She came herself, in person, and she asked." The library was very quiet. "She asked," Harry said. "She asked." Daphne looked at the contract on the table between them. "My parents agreed. I don't know all of their reasons. My mother told me it was a matter of... She said it was a matter of recognizing something real when someone brought it to you." She looked back at him. I don't know exactly what she meant. Harry looked at the signatures on the parchment. A Muggle-born witch in 1981, at the height of a war she and her husband were fighting in the middle of, had gone, herself, alone, to one of the sacred 28 families, and asked them to sign a betrothal contract binding her infant son to their infant daughter. Had gone and asked, had stood in their house and looked at them and asked. He did not know why. He didn't have enough yet to even imagine why. But she had done it deliberately, and she had done it in person, and some family he had never heard of had looked at a Muggle-born woman coming to their door with a request that probably would have shocked them and said yes. He opened his mouth to say something. He wasn't sure what. And then the voice came. It came from the corridor outside, amplified and ragged, a voice gone loose at its edges with something that might have been fear or might have been performance. "Troll in the dungeons. Troll in the dungeons. I thought you should know." And then a crash, and then the very specific silence of an entire building holding its breath. Harry stood up. His chair scraped back. He grabbed the contract from the table and shoved it into his robes. His mind was doing something fast, assembling information, and what came up was this: Hermione. The bathroom on the second floor. She had been there since Charms. She would not know. "Hermione is in the bathroom," he said aloud. He moved. Daphne followed him without discussion. The corridor outside the library was already filling with the movement of students being directed away from their common rooms toward the Great Hall by the time Harry and Daphne pushed against the current. He could hear Hermione before he could see her, or rather, he could hear the troll before he could see either of them, a sound like a very large thing moving through a space too small for it, accompanied by the specific, dull impacts of something being hit repeatedly against a stone floor without much method or precision. The second-floor corridor near the girls' bathroom was narrow, and it was full. Full of troll, 12 feet of it, in the way trolls occupy space, with a club and no particular agenda beyond expressing itself. And in the far corner, Hermione Granger, backed against the wall, not screaming because she had gone somewhere past screaming, into a focused, white-faced place that was not quite calm, but functioned like it. Harry raised his wand. His brain produced the 2 words he needed. A 2-week-old lesson. Charms, Professor Flitwick, on the edge of his stack of books, the whole class practicing the swish and flick, and he said them with the concentration of someone for whom this was not a drill. Wingardium Leviosa. The club left the troll's hand in a slow, improbable arc. It was very heavy, and it was very high, and then it was no longer rising. In the seconds before it fell, the troll shifted toward Hermione. Its arm swung out. Daphne Greengrass stepped in front of her. No wand. No spell. Just herself, with her back to Hermione and her face to the reaching arm, deliberate as anything Harry had ever seen anyone do. And then the club came down on the troll's head, and the troll went down, and the corridor was very suddenly very quiet, except for the dust settling. Harry looked at where Daphne was standing. She was still standing. Hermione was behind her, unhurt. McGonagall arrived approximately 90 seconds later, with an expression that communicated simultaneously that she was enormously relieved and deeply displeased, and Professor Snape arrived behind her with an expression that communicated nothing at all in a very deliberate way, and the troll was confirmed unconscious, and Hermione was confirmed unhurt, and Harry was asked a series of questions and gave answers that were technically accurate, and then Hermione was walked back toward the Gryffindor common room, and Harry found himself standing in the corridor outside the bathroom with plaster dust on his robes, and no adults looking at him for the first time since the troll had fallen. Daphne was standing a few feet away, her bag still on her shoulder. He said, "You didn't have to come." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. She turned and walked in the direction of the dungeons. Harry stood in the corridor for another moment, then followed the direction Hermione had gone. He lay in his dormitory later that night and held the contract in both hands and looked at the ceiling and thought, October 31st, 1991. 10 years to the day. And she was already gone 10 years before he had known what to call the gap. And she had done something he didn't understand yet, for reasons he didn't know yet. And she had come to them herself, and she had asked. She had stood in a stranger's house in 1981, and she had asked. The ceiling gave him nothing. The contract was warm from his hands. He was still holding it when he fell asleep. November arrived with cold corridors, and the particular grey quality of Scottish skies that seemed to be deciding between rain and something worse. The troll incident had been contained in the way that Hogwarts contained things. The staff spoke to the relevant students understood that certain things did not leave the room, and the school proceeded with the institutional discretion of a place that had been through considerably worse. Hermione Granger was quieter than usual for several days, and then she wasn't. She began working on an essay with Ron at the same table in the common room one Tuesday evening, unprompted, and Ron made a joke about something, and she laughed, genuinely, not politely. And that was, as far as Harry could tell, the shape of what had changed between them. She did not make a scene of it, and neither did Ron, which was exactly right. What she did not say aloud, and what Harry noticed anyway, she had not forgotten what Daphne Greengrass had done. He saw her track Daphne's movements once in the Great Hall, not with warmth, not with anything complicated, just the specific attention of someone adding information to a category that didn't yet have a name. Hermione always created categories for things. This was going in one. Potions, the second week of November, was a shared lesson as usual, and Harry spent 40 minutes not looking at Daphne Greengrass across the classroom, which was a different activity from not being aware of her. He measured his lacewing flies. He stirred. He produced something that Snape assessed without expression and moved past, which Harry had learned to count as conditional praise. The class ended, and the students filed out. Harry was the last one. He had dropped his quill under the work table and spent longer than necessary retrieving it, and by the time he straightened up and began pushing his things into his bag, the room was empty, except for Professor Snape, who was at his desk making notes in a hand so small and precise it looked like an insect's work. Snape did not look up. "Your mother," he said, "had a talent for making arrangements that surprised people." Harry stopped moving. The room was very quiet. The single torch in the corner produced its single quantity of light, and Snape continued to write, his quill moving without pause, as though he had said nothing of particular interest, or as though whatever he had said was simply a fact about the world that required noting and moving on from. Harry stood behind his bench with his bag half-fastened, and his hands on the clasp, and said nothing, because he had not yet located the right thing to say. Snape looked up. His expression gave nothing away. It did the specific thing it always did, occupied a territory between contempt and calculation, and something else that Harry could never identify. And he held Harry's gaze for a moment, with the patience of someone who has chosen their words very carefully and is waiting to see what they land in. "Dismissed, Potter," he said. Harry walked out of the dungeon and up the corridor and stood at the top of the first stone staircase for a long time, not going anywhere. Snape had known Lily Evans since they were children. He would have known about the contract because she would have told him, or because Daphne was a Slytherin and Snape was head of Slytherin, and the Greengrass family would have told the head of house. Both paths led to the same destination. Snape knew. What he had chosen to say was one sentence. It was the sentence of someone who knows considerably more than they have said, and intends to continue knowing it in private. Harry filed this next to Dumbledore's "You have time to understand it," which he had also filed, and McGonagall's "This is a matter for the headmaster," and the growing sense that he was the last person in the building to be told a thing that apparently a number of adults had known for 10 years. He told Ron that evening. He kept the details short, because Ron's patience for the contract, while genuine, had a specific shape, and Harry had learned the shape of it. Ron listened with his arms folded, sitting on his bed with his feet up. He was quiet for a moment. "So Snape knew," he said, "about the contract." "He must have." Ron nodded slowly, working through it. and then he looked at Harry with an expression that was different from the contract-adjacent expression, and was something else, closer and less comfortable. "You keep talking about her," he said. "Daphne. You didn't used to." Harry opened his mouth. "The troll," he said. I know that." Ron said it in the way of someone acknowledging a true thing that doesn't quite address the question. We'd both have gone after Hermione. A pause. "But you talk about her, how she looked in the corridor, how she handled Snape's class. You clock where she sits." He stopped. "She's still a Slytherin," he said, which was what it was. Not quite a statement and not quite a question. More the sound of someone not knowing how to ask what they were actually trying to ask. Harry didn't answer it. Partly because he didn't know the answer. Partly because he wasn't sure the answer existed yet, in a form that fit inside words. In the weeks since Halloween, Harry had noticed a pattern to how the people around Daphne Greengrass arranged themselves. Draco's shoulder turning away when she entered a space. Pansy's particular expressions when she thought the person they were about wasn't looking. Blaze's pointed neutrality, which was its own statement. Harry didn't know exactly what had shifted in the Slytherin dynamics or when, but he recognized the shape of it the way you recognize any social pressure, by the slight adjustment it required of the person receiving it. He had seen it once, clearly. A Tuesday, between charms and lunch, the corridor on the 3rd floor, Daphne passing him without acknowledgement, which was standard, nothing unusual in it. She had not seen him see her, which was the important part. Her composure was complete. She looked entirely, perfectly in control of herself. And it was this, the completeness of it. The way it held its shape with the particular tension of something that was working to hold a shape under pressure. That was the thing he couldn't unfeel having noticed it. He didn't tell Ron that part. Hermione had been in the library again. She came back the following evening with her parchment and her focused expression, and sat down across from Harry at the common room table. "I've been going further back," she said, "into wizarding family legal history. Not just the contract mechanism, the history of who used them." Harry leaned forward. Ron put his exploding snap cards down. "Contracts like yours," she said, "were more common before the First Wizarding War, significantly more common. In the years before it started, they were actually relatively standard instruments. Pure-blood families used them for social reasons, obviously, but there's also evidence of other kinds of arrangements. Cross-status arrangements." She looked at Harry. Muggle-born witches were making them with established families in the decades before the war. There's a whole section in one of the older law commentaries. "Why did they stop?" Harry said. "The war changed things. The books don't say exactly how, but the climate. After Voldemort and everything to do with blood status, you can imagine that a Muggle-born making a formal arrangement with a sacred 28 family would have become complicated, dangerous even, depending on where the family stood." She tapped her quill on the table. "I don't know everything yet. But whatever your mother was thinking in 1981, she was operating in a context where that kind of arrangement had precedent. It wasn't unprecedented. It was unusual, but it wasn't impossible." Harry sat with that for a while after Hermione had closed her notes. He lay in bed later with the lamplight still on, the contract on the blanket in front of him, and he turned it over in his mind, the way he had been turning it over for weeks. Snape had known and chosen to say one sentence. Dumbledore had known and returned the contract with "take the time." His mother had planned this in 1981, in the middle of a war, at some point before she was killed, on the night that had defined the entire rest of his life. And now there was history behind it, a context, a world in which this kind of thing had once been possible, before the war made it otherwise. He was 3 days past the November midpoint. The window was still open. The mystery was not getting smaller. It was getting larger in a specific way, not expanding randomly outward, but acquiring depth, the kind of depth that suggested there was something at the bottom of it that might, eventually, be reached. He turned out the light and lay in the dark with his hand on the parchment, and waited for something he could not have named to settle, which it did not. The pitch was cold, and the sky was the low pewter colour of a Scottish November, and Harry was 200 feet up on a broomstick he had only been flying for 2 months, which was approximately 2 months more experience than he would have wanted for the first time he flew in front of the entire school. Gryffindor versus Slytherin. The stands were full and loud. He did not look for her in the crowd. He was a seeker. His job was the snitch. He found his position above the game and held it, circling with his eyes on the middle distance, feeling the wind off the mountains and the particular cold quality of November air at altitude. Below him, the game moved in its patterns, chasers, bludgers, the keeper at each end, and he tracked all of it in the way McGonagall had told him to in their first seeker conversation, peripherally, the snitch first, everything else as context. He had been in position for 20 minutes when his broom moved. Not a gust of wind. Not a wobble of inexperience. Something else. A wrong movement. A judder in the wood that had no cause he could identify. And then another. And then the broom was vibrating under him with the specific determination of something being acted on from outside himself. He tightened his grip. The broom bucked. He pulled it level and it bucked again, harder, and the stands below registered this with a noise that was different from the noise of the game. He held on. His knuckles were white on the handle. The broom jerked left and he jerked with it, legs clamping, and he could see from here, just barely, Hermione in the Gryffindor stands looking in the wrong direction, looking at Snape in the staff area, watching Snape with an expression of fierce concentration. Snape was muttering. Harry could not tell from here what Snape was muttering, and he had approximately no capacity to think about it, because the broom bucked again, and he nearly came off the side. He held on. He did not know how long it lasted. 30 seconds. A minute. Long enough for his arms to begin to burn, and his vision to develop a quality that had more to do with fear than altitude. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the broom was still. Smooth under him again, normal, answering his hands with the ordinary cooperation of a good broomstick. He breathed. He looked at the middle distance. A glint of gold. He went. In the Slytherin stands, he was aware of the noise around him, in the fragmented way you are aware of crowd noise when you are going very fast toward a very small thing. Draco's voice, distinguishable even in the blur, some running commentary of contempt, arms wide, performing for his section the way Draco performed everything. Pansy's high voice underneath it, specifically against Harry, specifically the way Pansy was specifically against everything she considered beneath her or threatening to someone she had allied herself with. And silence. A specific point of silence in the Slytherin stands that he catalogued without fully processing, because he was too busy going very fast. He caught the snitch in his mouth. This was not the plan. There was not, strictly speaking, a plan. He had been pulling up to reach it, and it had gone sideways at the last second, and he had gone with his instincts, and his instincts had apparently involved biting. And then there it was, between his teeth, wings beating against his lips, and he pulled up and spat it into his palm, and the whistle sounded, and Gryffindor won. The pitch was suddenly very loud, and very red and gold. Ron reached him first, somehow, already off the stands and somehow on the pitch. Harry would never fully understand how Ron moved so fast when occasion required. And Hermione was there too, flushed and triumphant, and people were making noise all around him and clapping him on the back, and he was fairly sure Oliver Wood was somewhere in the vicinity being emotional. He looked up at the Slytherin stands once. Daphne Greengrass was already walking away. He found her that evening in the corridor outside the library. Their corridor, he had started thinking of it, which said something he was not fully prepared to examine. And neither of them had arranged to be there at the same time. And both of them were. "You didn't cheer against me," he said. She looked at him with an expression he had spent 3 months learning and still could not fully decode. "I'm a Slytherin," she said. "Not an idiot. You caught the snitch." He almost smiled. She did not quite, but something shifted at the edge of her expression that was adjacent to it. He leaned against the wall. She didn't move to leave. "Today," he said. He counted it on his fingers, not because he needed to, but because he had been counting it in his head since he woke up, and the gesture was an old habit by now. November 29th. "Yes," she said. He looked at the contract in his hand. He had taken it out of his robes when he had been leaning here alone before she arrived, and it had been in his hand since, and he was still holding it now. "The window," she said. "Today is the day." "I know." He stood with the contract. The corridor was empty around them, and the castle was making its evening sounds. Distant voices, the far noise of the great hall, the creak of settling stone. And he turned the parchment over in his hands once. "I don't want to void it," he said. "Not yet." Daphne looked at him. "Why not?" He had been thinking about how to say this since the snitch had gone between his teeth, and he had suddenly had nothing to focus on except the ground rushing up and the one thing he could not stop thinking about. He said it the way it had come to him, mid-fall, at 200 feet, without editing it first. "Because I want to know why she signed it first, before I make a decision about it." He held the contract up slightly, as though the gesture clarified something. "If I void it without knowing why, I'm throwing away the only question I'll never be able to ask her. And I can't ask her anything. I can't ask her anything at all. But if I keep this, I can at least keep looking for the answer." The corridor was quiet. Daphne stood at her full height with her arms at her sides and looked at him with the expression she used when she was running several things at once behind an entirely composed surface. And he let the silence sit, because he had learned, over 3 months of corridor conversations, that she thought better in silence, and there was no use filling it. She said, "I want to know too." He waited. "Why your mother came to my family." The words came with the measured precision she brought to everything, but slower, less performance in them, more something actual. "I was 1 year old. I don't remember any of it. My parents have told me a version of what happened. I would like to know whether the version they told me is true." Harry looked at her. This was the most she had told him about herself in any conversation since September. He registered this without making a scene of it, because he was 11 and she was 11, and making a scene of things was not how this worked between them, and he was beginning to understand that. He held the contract. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Neither of them moved to sign a renunciation. They stood in the corridor outside the library on November 29th, 1991, and the window passed, and the contract remained unsigned and unvoided and alive between them. And this was, Harry recognized, the first thing they had chosen together that was not the contract itself requiring it. Not obligation, not the terms, just both of them in the same corridor, with the same question, choosing the same thing. It didn't feel like an arrangement. "All right," he said. "All right," Daphne said. She walked back toward the dungeons. He walked back toward the tower, The contract went back in his left pocket, where it lived, the same as it had since September, except that now it was there by choice. The castle emptied over the last few days of term, students peeling away with their trunks and their owls, until by Christmas Eve the great hall set only 2 tables, and the portraits had mostly gone to visit other paintings. Harry stayed. He had stayed for the obvious reason, which was that the alternative was the Dursleys, and Christmas at the Dursleys had never been an occasion that required elaborate explanation. Ron stayed too, because Ron's family were going to visit Ron's brother Charlie in Romania, and because Ron had sensed, without Harry saying anything, that company would be welcome. Daphne Greengrass went home. Harry noticed this, the absence of a specific figure in the diminishing population of the castle, and filed it next to the other things he noticed about Daphne Greengrass, which had become a category of some size. He received the invisibility cloak on Christmas morning. It was in a parcel with no note. He unwrapped it at the foot of his bed, while Ron watched with his mouth open, and the castle outside was completely, extraordinarily silent, and he held the cloak up in the pale winter light, and it slipped through his hands like water, like something that wasn't quite material. There was a scrap of parchment with it, unsigned, and all it said was, "Use it well." He did not know who had sent it. He thought about it for most of Christmas Day, between a very good Christmas lunch and a very long game of wizard's chess in which Ron defeated him so thoroughly it almost became embarrassing. "You're not concentrating," Ron said. He said it without accusation, just the observation of someone who plays chess at a level where distraction is immediately legible. "I'm fine," Harry said. Ron moved his queen with the composed assurance of someone who was going to let the game make the argument. Harry was not fine. He was distracted in the specific way of someone who had been turning the same question over for 3 months and had a new object, a silver cloak, soft as something that had no name, and no good reason not to use it. He used it that night. The castle at night, under the invisibility cloak, was a different building. The same stone, the same torchlight, but all of it at a different angle. The angle of someone moving through a space without being part of it, without being seen, which was an angle Harry had some experience with, in a less literal sense, and found he recognized. He wandered without a specific destination, past darkened classrooms and sleeping portraits, and the 3rd-floor corridor, with something behind its locked door that he had been choosing not to think about. He found the room by accident. It was a large room on the 4th floor, an unused classroom that had been cleared of desks, and in the middle of it stood a mirror. An enormous mirror in a gold frame, taller than 2 men, with an inscription carved along the top that Harry had to look at twice before it resolved into something. Erised stra eru, oit ube kafru, oit onvosi. He stood in front of it and looked. The room behind him in the mirror was empty, which was true. He was there in the mirror, which was true. And then around him in the mirror were people who were not in the room. A woman with dark red hair. She was smiling. Not a photograph smile. Not the captured frame of someone performing happiness for a camera. Something more ordinary and more true than that. The smile of someone in the middle of an afternoon who has had a thought she has found genuinely amusing. She was standing close enough that Harry in the mirror could have reached out and touched her shoulder. Beside her, a man with the same round glasses and the same wild dark hair, slightly taller, who was looking at the woman with the expression of someone who has been looking at this particular person for years and still finds the looking worthwhile. And others. People he didn't know but whose faces had a genetic familiarity. The angle of a cheekbone, the line of a brow, who stood around him with the easiness of people who have always been there, He did not know how long he stood there. He came back the next night, and the night after that. On the fourth night, he brought the contract. He wasn't sure when he decided to bring it. It wasn't a decision so much as a compulsion, the same kind of compulsion that had brought him to the mirror in the first place. Some half-formed instinct, a question that had no language yet, but was using this instead. He stood in front of the mirror with the contract in his hands, the familiar weight of it, and looked. She was there again, writing. He had not seen this before. She was at a table, her head inclined, and her hand moved across parchment with the motion he knew. The way you know a thing you have memorized without meaning to memorize it. The rightward slant, the particular movement at the end of certain letters, the looped descender that was a shepherd's crook. He could not read what she was writing. The mirror didn't show him that. It showed him her hand, and the motion of it, and the loops forming one after another, across parchment. He couldn't see clearly enough to read. He watched those letters form. That, he thought. That is what it looked like, when she wrote her name on this, when she wrote the thing in my left pocket. She sat somewhere, and her hand moved like that, and she made this. "You have been here several nights now," said a voice behind him. Harry nearly dropped the contract. Dumbledore stood in the doorway with no particular quality of having crept there. He simply occupied the doorway, as he occupied most spaces, with the patient ease of someone who had been waiting in doorways since before Harry's parents were born. He moved into the room and stood beside Harry and looked into the mirror with the expression of a person who had looked into this mirror before and had arrived at some conclusions about what it cost. "It shows you what you most desire," Dumbledore said. "Not what is real. Not what is possible. What you want most, whatever form that takes." He looked at Harry, not the mirror. The happiest man alive would look into this and see only himself, exactly as he is. Harry looked at his mother's hand, moving across invisible parchment. "It won't do to dwell on it," Dumbledore said. His voice was gentle with the gentleness of someone who means something difficult and has chosen the softest available way to say it. The mirror has driven men to. It is not a good thing to spend your nights here. I must ask you not to come back. Harry looked at the mirror for one more moment. Then he looked at what was in his hands. He held the contract up, not offering it, just presenting it in the way of someone saying, "You see this. You know about this." Dumbledore looked at it. A beat. The room was very quiet. "Did you know about this?" Harry said. Dumbledore looked at the contract for a moment longer. Then he looked at Harry. "Yes," he said. It was the first time any adult had said that word about the contract, unhedged, directly, without a deflection or a non-answer or a carefully constructed non-yes. Harry stood with the yes in the room and felt it land with all the weight of 3 months of non-yeses. "Did she tell you why?" Dumbledore looked at the mirror. Not at Harry, not at the contract. At the mirror, with the expression of someone who has decided what they are and are not going to say, and is looking at something that has nothing to do with the conversation, as a way of not looking at the thing that does. "She told me enough," he said. Harry waited. "You have time," Dumbledore said. The same words he always said, in the same patient voice. "You are 11 years old. You have years in which to understand this, if you approach it carefully." He turned from the mirror at last. "Do not come back to this mirror, Harry." He meant the mirror. Harry was quite sure he meant the mirror. He was not entirely sure he didn't also mean something else. He walked back through the empty castle alone, the invisibility cloak around his shoulders, the contract in his hand. Torches moved in their brackets in the draught from somewhere, and the portrait slept, and the stone was cold and still beneath his feet, and he was invisible, and he was 11, and Dumbledore had said yes. He had told her. She had told Dumbledore in 1981 about the arrangement she was making. She had gone to the Greengrasses, and she had come back, and she had told Dumbledore, and Dumbledore had known for 10 years, and Dumbledore had given Harry a cloak that had apparently been his father's, and had returned the contract twice with "You have time." He didn't know what to do with this yet. He put the contract away. The castle was very quiet, and the Christmas dark outside was deep and complete, and he walked back toward the tower, and by the time he climbed through the portrait hole, he had decided the only thing he could, that he did not yet have enough to understand, and that he intended to keep looking until he did. Students returned to Hogwarts in the first week of January, with the particular noise of people who have been somewhere else, and have brought the elsewhere back with them, new things in their trunks, conversations from home that trailed into the corridors and dormitories like steam, a general readjustment to cold castle mornings and shared spaces after 2 weeks of relative freedom. Daphne Greengrass returned on the 3rd day. Harry noticed the way he noticed most things about her now, which was more quickly than he would have expected, and more clearly than was entirely comfortable. She was in the great hall at breakfast, in her usual seat, and she was the same person she had been in December, same composed posture, same watchful attention. But there was something different in it, a degree of care, as though the composure that had always been a natural quality had become, over the holidays, deliberate. She held herself with the specific manner of someone who has been somewhere and heard things, and decided how much of what they heard to show. He told Hermione. Hermione looked at Daphne across the great hall for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I see it." Ron ate his eggs and said nothing, which was not quite the same as not noticing. Ron simply had a different threshold for the kinds of noticing that required comment. It became clear what the threshold was when Draco found Harry in the corridor, between charms and lunch on a Friday in the 2nd week of term. Harry had been expecting something. He was not sure what form it would take, but he had been watching Draco's particular quality of not looking all week, the way it had sharpened since Christmas, the way it had become less performance and more calculation, and the form it took was this: Draco falling into step beside him in the 3rd floor corridor, just the two of them in a stretch of empty stone, with Pansy and Blaze a deliberate half-pace behind. He did not waste time on preamble. "I've been speaking with my father over Christmas," Draco said. His voice had a quality Harry had not heard before, measured, almost formal, as though he were reciting something that had been given to him in a specific shape, and he was presenting it in that shape. "My father has considerable experience with wizarding family law." Harry kept walking. "The contract your mother signed," Draco continued, "is unenforceable. My father is quite certain of this. The contract is unenforceable because Lily Potter was a mudblood. He said the word with the precision of someone who has been told a word is a weapon and has been practicing the delivery. Not raised, not shouted. Just placed in the sentence, exactly where it would land." Harry stopped walking. He stood in the corridor with his bag on his shoulder, and the stone wall to his left, and the word in the air between them, and the specific pressure in his chest of something that wanted very much to be expressed through his fists and was not going to be. "Muggle-borns," Draco said, with the composed patience of someone running through a prepared argument, "lack the formal standing in wizarding pure-blood legal tradition to enter their minor children into binding betrothal arrangements with established sacred 28 families. My father has confirmed this. The contract is void on the grounds that it was signed by someone without the requisite social standing to sign it. He paused. You're not actually bound to a Greengrass. You never were. The whole arrangement is an embarrassment to both parties. Harry said nothing. There was nothing he could say. He did not know enough about wizarding legal tradition to argue with what Draco had just said. He did not know whether it was true or fabricated or something in between, designed to be just plausible enough to plant a doubt and just technical enough to be difficult to refute without the kind of expertise he did not have at 11. He stood in the corridor and said nothing, and felt the silence read in Draco's expression as a very specific kind of confirmation. "Good," Draco said, in the tone of someone concluding a meeting. He turned and walked away, Pansy at his shoulder and Blaze a step behind, and the corridor was empty again, and the word was still in the air, and Harry stood with it. He heard a footstep. Daphne Greengrass stepped out from around the corner 10 feet away. She had been in the corridor the entire time. She looked at Harry with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of which she was going to explain unprompted. "Come with me," she said. He followed. She took him to the corridor outside the library, the corridor that had become, without anyone declaring it, the place where they talked, when they talked. And she stopped and faced him and said, without any preamble, without any warmth, without any heat either, "What he told you is wrong." Harry waited. The legality of a betrothal contract does not depend on the blood status of the signing party. It depends on two things: the magical intent embedded in the act of signing, and the formal acceptance by both families at the time of signing. Your mother had magic. She had intention. She signed the document with a witness present. My family accepted the terms and co-signed with their own witness. Daphne's voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of someone who had been told something recently and had decided to repeat it exactly. Both of those conditions were met. The contract is therefore legally valid regardless of anyone's views about the signing party's bloodline. Lucius Malfoy is wrong, or he knows it is wrong, and said it anyway, which tells you something about what he was trying to accomplish. Harry looked at her. "How do you know that? About the legal conditions?" "My mother told me at Christmas." She anticipated that someone might argue this. A pause. She was not wrong. He took that in. Her mother had anticipated Lucius Malfoy making this argument. Her mother had given Daphne the counter-argument before she sent Daphne back to school. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "You could have. You heard what he said. You could have let me think it." She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to offer. "Because no one else was going to," she said. A pause. She did not end there. "And because the Malfoys deciding what my family intends is not something I will allow." There was something in her voice he did not usually hear. Not emotion, exactly, but the place where emotion had been before it had been converted into decision. "This contract is my family's business. It is yours and mine to settle. It is not a matter for Lucius Malfoy or his son, and I will not stand in a corridor and allow it to be treated as one." Harry stood with this for a moment. It was not loyalty. He understood that. She was not defending him. She was defending her family's position, the validity of their legal instrument, the autonomy of the Greengrass name against the Malfoy name, which was its own kind of Slytherin principle. This was not about him. But she had also looked at him across a corridor in which he had been offered a reason to give up on the contract, and had stepped out of the shadow and said, "That reason is wrong." He was not entirely sure those were entirely separate things. "All right," he said. She looked at him steadily. Ask Hermione Granger to confirm the legal framework. She will find the same sources. You don't think I believe you? Something shifted in her expression, so briefly he almost missed it. It was not quite what he would have called amusement. I think you should always verify, she said. She turned and went back toward the dungeons. Harry stood in the corridor outside the library for a moment, then went to find Hermione, because Daphne was right about that, and probably about most things, and also because verifying was the correct instinct, and he was learning, slowly, that this was the way you thought when you were Slytherin about something. He was still Gryffindor. He checked the contract in his left pocket on his way up the stairs, force of habit, making sure it was still there. It was. Spring came to Hogwarts grudgingly, in starts, with cold, clear days that retreated back to grey before they settled. Harry noticed it intermittently. He was busy noticing other things. The business with the Philosopher's Stone had been assembling itself since September, and by May they knew enough to know they didn't know enough. Someone was trying to steal it. They suspected Snape. Hermione kept pointing out the distinction between suspecting and knowing, and Harry had filed it under unresolved, and he knew, with the physical certainty of someone who has felt a thing approaching since before they had a name for it, that it was coming to a point. It was this particular knowledge, the weight of it, not the fear of it, which was a different thing, that he was carrying when he found Daphne Greengrass in the library on an evening in early May, bent over a transfiguration essay, with the focused attention she brought to everything, as though concentration were a resource that could be maximized through correct application of posture. He sat across from her without asking. She looked up briefly, registered him, returned to her essay. He did not open a book. She finished a sentence and put her quill down. "You've been sitting there for 10 minutes without doing anything," she said. "I know." She looked at him with the expression he had been learning for 9 months, the one that was more attentive than it appeared. "What's wrong?" He thought about how to say it. "Something is going to happen," he said. "Something bad. And I'm fairly sure, that I'm the only one who can stop it. And I don't entirely know what that means, and I know how it sounds." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is an absurdly Gryffindor thing to believe," she said. "I know." She held his gaze. He expected her to say, "You're probably wrong." Or, "Ask a teacher." Or, "That's not your responsibility." She did not say any of these things. "And you are probably right," she said. She picked up her quill. She did not return to the essay. The library was quiet around them. The late light came through high windows and made long rectangular shapes on the floor between the shelves, and somewhere a book shifted on its own accord, resettling. Harry looked at the table. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Properly. I've asked before in pieces. I want to ask it all at once." She waited. "What did your parents tell you?" He meant, specifically, completely. "About why she came." Daphne set her quill down. She was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, he thought, but arranging something. The way you arrange things when you have been given them in a particular shape, and you want to give them in the same shape. "My mother told me the full account over Christmas," she said. After the term ended, I think she decided I was old enough." He waited. "Your mother came to us in the summer of 1981, Daphne said. "My mother was very specific about this. It was summer, before the autumn. Before everything that happened in October." She looked at the table as she spoke, not at him. The war was at its worst point by then. People were dying. The Order of the Phoenix was fighting. but they were losing ground, and the people on the front lines of it knew they were losing ground. Your mother and father had defied him directly, 3 times. They knew they were targets. Harry listened. She came to our house alone. No solicitor, no intermediary. She came herself, and she asked to speak with my parents, and they sat with her, and she told them what she was afraid of. Daphne's voice was precise and even. She said she was not afraid for herself. She said that twice. My mother remembered that specifically, that she said it twice. She was afraid for you. He was very still. She told them, if both she and James were killed, Harry would have no legal standing in the wizarding world. No adult in the wizarding world would be formally obligated by any tie or instrument to bring him into it or fight for his place in it. He would go to her Muggle family. He had no wizarding relatives through her, and if James died too, there would be no one with a legal obligation to argue that he belonged here. Daphne looked up at him now, and her eyes were the pale grey they always were, watchful and measuring, but there was something in them that was not her usual composure. She said she was afraid that he would disappear into the Muggle world, and no one would fight for him to come back. Harry said nothing. The library was very quiet. So she wanted to create a document, Daphne continued. Not a marriage arrangement. She was clear about that, my mother said. She wanted a legal instrument that gave you a formal tie to a wizarding family, one who would have an obligation, a legal, documented obligation, to advocate for your placement in the wizarding world if it ever became necessary, one who would have standing to argue for you. She paused. The betrothal contract was the strongest available instrument. A sacred 28 family co-signing something on your behalf would carry more legal weight than almost anything else she could create. Why your family? Harry said. His voice came out steady. He was not sure how. Because we had no Death Eaters, Daphne said. In our family. My mother was very direct about this. Your mother came to us because we were Sacred 28. But we had kept our distance from Voldemort's inner circle. We had not taken the mark. We had not pledged ourselves. We had. My parents used the word integrity, and they meant it in a specific legal and social sense. We had not made ourselves complicit. She needed a family with enough standing to matter, and enough history to be trusted with something she was about to entrust to us. A pause. She chose deliberately. She researched. She came to us because she looked at the families available and decided we were the ones who would not hand her son's fate to the wrong people. Harry sat with this. He sat with it for a long time, and Daphne did not move, and the library was quiet around them, and the light from the high windows moved slowly across the floor. She had been afraid. Not for herself. She said it twice. She had sat in a room with strangers and said, I am not afraid for myself. She had gone to a pure-blood family in the middle of a blood purity war and asked them to sign a legal instrument, creating an obligation toward her son, because she was afraid that if she died, he would be forgotten, that he would end up somewhere that didn't want him and no one would come. He thought about the Dursleys' spare room. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. She was trying to keep me safe, he said. Yes, Daphne said. He looked at the contract on the table in front of him. He had taken it out at some point without consciously deciding to, the same way his hand always found it. Even from the thing she didn't think would happen, he said, ending up with people who didn't want me. He felt, rather than saw, Daphne Greengrass sit very still across from him. Especially from that, she said. Very quietly. He nodded. He did not trust what his voice would do if he opened it. He held the parchment in both hands, his mother's handwriting on the inside of the fold, the looping, rightward slanting hand he had memorized from the backs of photographs before he ever knew it had signed something. She had done this. In the summer of 1981, knowing she might die, she had made this. She had sat in strangers' company, and she had asked, and they had said yes, and she had put quill to parchment, and she had made this specific act out of a specific fear for a specific person. Him, who had been small enough at the time to not know it was happening, who had grown up not knowing, who had carried it for 9 months without knowing what it was. He knew now. He put the contract carefully back in his left pocket. He left the library. He walked through the spring corridors of Hogwarts, the stone cool and the torches burning in their brackets, and the distant sounds of the school going about its evening. And he carried what he now knew, the way you carry something that has changed its weight. It was the same object, the same parchment, the same ink. But now it had a different gravity, because now he knew what it had cost her to make it. She had been afraid. She had fought in a war and faced Voldemort 3 times, and she had sat across from strangers and told them she was afraid. Because the fear was for him, and the fear was real, and she had done something about it. It was the last act of protection she completed before the one that would kill her. He was not sure he deserved it. He was not sure deserving had anything to do with it. He thought, I know now. I know what you were trying to do. He thought, it didn't work the way you wanted. They still took me to the Dursleys. No one came, he thought, but I'm still here. They went on a Tuesday. Fluffy slept, the trapdoor opened, Devil's Snare, flying keys, and then Wizard's Chess, where Ron made his final move with the complete composure of someone who had always known it would end this way. He was unconscious before he hit the stone floor, and Harry would not allow himself to look back for more than a second, because a second was all he had. The troll beyond was already dealt with. Hermione solved the potions puzzle and pressed the right vial into Harry's hand at the last door. You go on, she said. He went on. The room beyond was the mirror of Erised's chamber, and the mirror was there, and Quirrell was there, and everything else dropped away. Quirrell had a quality now that he had kept hidden under the stutter and the turban and the garlic all year, the specific quality of someone who no longer needs to pretend. He was composed and cold, and his turban was unwinding at the back of his head. The stone came out of the mirror and into Harry's pocket. He didn't try to understand how. He understood only that he had stood in front of this mirror in December and wanted to find the stone without using it, and the mirror had given it to him exactly as advertised. And now it was in his pocket, and Quirrell was moving toward him. The voice that came from the back of Quirrell's head was not a voice Harry had words for, not a sound so much as a pressure, something that went directly to the part of the brain that processes threat and asked it to report, continuously, at full volume. It told him to give it the stone. It told him what would happen if he didn't. Harry stood in the chamber with the stone in his pocket, and Quirrell's hands reaching for him, and said nothing. Quirrell's hands closed on his arm. The sound Quirrell made was not something Harry had heard before. He released Harry immediately, released him violently, stepping back, and his hands were wrong, the skin of them blistering and splitting where they had made contact with Harry's arm, and Harry looked at his own hands, and they were fine. And the voice from behind Quirrell's head was screaming something, and Quirrell was moving forward again, more careful this time, reaching for Harry's face. Harry grabbed his face back. The skin of Quirrell's face was worse than the hands. Harry did not think about this. He did not make a plan. He simply held on to the face of the man who was trying to take something Lily Potter had died to protect, and Quirrell was burning under his hands, and the screaming from the back of Quirrell's head became the sound of something tearing. And then Quirrell fell. Then the floor came up to meet Harry, and there was a light that might have been the stone pulsing in his pocket, and then there was nothing for a while. He woke to Dumbledore. The hospital wing was quiet and bright, and Dumbledore was sitting in the chair beside his bed with the patience of someone who had been sitting there for however long it had been, and was prepared to sit for however long remained. He told Harry about the stone, destroyed, as Flamel had requested and chosen. He told Harry that Ron and Hermione were well. He told Harry that he was well, which was more or less true if you discounted the particular exhaustion that came from having touched something that had killed two far better prepared people before him. Harry lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling and waited until he had the words for the thing he was trying to say. "In the chamber," he said, "when he touched me. It burned him." "Yes," Dumbledore said. That was my mother." "That was your mother," Dumbledore agreed. His voice was the same as it always was, but there was a quality in it now that was different from its usual careful warmth. Something more direct, less hedged. What Lily did when she died was not simply die. She made a choice. The choice was an act of love so complete that it left a mark, a protection. It lives in your skin. It has lived there since you were 1 year old. He looked at Harry over his spectacles. It cannot be touched by anyone who carries Voldemort's mark. It burns them. Harry thought about that. Then, "Did you know," he said, "when she went to the Greengrasses, did you know she was afraid?" Dumbledore was quiet. Not the quiet of someone choosing their words, not the considered pause of someone who was going to give him a partial answer, wrapped in a more complete answer. Just quiet. "Yes," he said. Harry let it land. "She told you." "She told me," Dumbledore said. "In the summer of 1981. She came to me after she had gone to the Greengrasses, and she told me what she had done and why she had done it." He looked at Harry steadily. "Your mother spent 1981 building walls she hoped you would never need. The one that saved you tonight. The one you have been carrying in your pocket all year. The same woman. The same impulse." He paused. "She never did anything only once when twice was possible." Harry lay in the hospital bed and held the contract in both hands. He had taken it out of his robes at some point. He couldn't have said when, and he held it now the way he had held it for 9 months, the familiar weight of the stiff archival parchment, his mother's handwriting folded against his palms. He had felt it in the chamber, when Quirrell had burned. He had not had the language for it in the moment, but now, in the quiet of the hospital wing, with Dumbledore's voice still in the room, he had the language. The same woman. The love magic in his skin was 10 years old. The contract in his hands was 10 years old. She had sat in the summer of 1981, and she had made both of them, in different rooms with different instruments, and they were the same wall. She had built everything she could build before she died. He put the contract on the blanket and looked at it. The feast was in the evening, because Hogwarts had feasts, and the year-end one was not cancelled for things like Philosopher's Stone crises. Dumbledore awarded points, to Harry and Ron and Hermione for the obvious reasons, and to Neville for something that Harry had missed while being unconscious, but which Hermione told him later was an act of quiet bravery that had made Hermione cry a little, which she also told him in a tone that dared him to comment. Gryffindor won the House Cup. The hall was very loud and very red and gold. Harry was present. He was not entirely there. The train left in the morning. The platform at Hogsmeade was the organized chaos of several hundred students, and their luggage, and their owls, and the particular noise of a large group of people who have been living together in confined quarters and are now in a transitional state between here and home. Harry had his trunk. Ron had already found a compartment. Hermione had coordinated them both. He was about to board when she was there. Daphne Greengrass. She had crossed the platform, not incidentally, not in passing. She had specifically come to where he was standing. She stood with her bag over her shoulder and her dark hair in the summer light, and she looked at him with the expression that had been unreadable to him in September, and that he could now, not fully, never fully, but considerably better than before, read. "I think she made a good choice," she said. He thought about that. "The contract still says what it says," he said. "I know." Something in her expression did a small, almost invisible thing that was not quite a smile, and was not a smile. That's a problem for later. She boarded the train. Harry stood on the platform for a moment. He looked at the contract in his hand. He had taken it out again without meaning to, force of habit, the reflex of 9 months. And he looked at his mother's handwriting, and he thought, yes, a problem for later. He has time. He has yours in which this can be a problem, in the way that problems you intend to solve are different from problems you are trying to avoid. He boarded the train. He found their compartment and put his trunk up and sat down, and the train began to move, the Hogwarts Express pulling away from Hogsmeade with its specific steady weight, and the mountains going past outside the window, and Scotland becoming the thing you were leaving, rather than the place you were. He opened his trunk. He took out the photograph album, just the front pages, the 4 photographs he always kept loose. And he looked at his mother's face for a moment. Then he put the contract underneath the album, underneath her face, in the trunk where the things he was keeping lived. He did not decide anything today.